I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Today, we're talking about headaches from hell. They hurt more than a gunshot wound, and they keep coming back. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Doctors know about cluster headaches, but the treatments they have to offer sufferers aren't always effective. Some patients are encouraging each other to consider psilocybin to get relief.
Is there research to support such a psychedelic solution? How does mainstream medicine deal with patient-led protocols?
We'll talk with a patient advocate and a headache specialist about various treatments for hard-to-treat head pain.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, why patients are using magic mushrooms for cluster headaches.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, what children usually eat for breakfast may affect whether or not they develop type 1 diabetes. The study was conducted in Finland, where rates of type 1 diabetes are high. Scientists kept tabs on more than 5,600 youngsters from birth to 6 years old. These kids were thought to be genetically predisposed to develop diabetes. The parents were asked to keep conscientious records on everything the children ate. During the study, 94 children developed type 1 diabetes and 206 developed a pre-diabetic condition called islet autoimmunity. Analysis of the data showed that children who ate more rye, oats, and fruit were more likely to develop diabetes. In addition, those who ate more bananas, wheat, and yogurt were at higher risk of islet autoimmunity. There were foods that were helpful. Kids consuming berries were protected to some degree. Vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower also seemed to be helpful.
Blood pressure measurements used to be conducted exclusively in doctors' offices, health clinics, or hospitals. But once easy-to-use affordable home monitors became available, millions of people took it upon themselves to monitor both their systolic and diastolic blood pressure at home or work. This allows for a better assessment of blood pressure under a variety of conditions. But a new study has identified a flaw in this system. The default cuff size that comes with most home blood pressure monitors is too small. Of the 10 devices that were reviewed, 9 offered cuff sizes that ranged from 22 to 42 centimeters in circumference. Data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey reveals that over 17 million adults have an arm circumference that's either smaller than 22 centimeters or greater than 42 centimeters.
A blood pressure cuff that's too small for a large arm can overestimate blood pressure readings by 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury. Equally, a cuff that's too large can underestimate blood pressure readings by about the same amount. The authors of the research point out that accurate blood pressure measurement is essential for the diagnosis and treatment of hypertension. The bottom line is that people with non-standard sized arms should make sure to purchase blood pressure cuffs of the correct size. When blood pressure is measured in a healthcare setting, the nurse or technician should also make sure to use the correct size cuff.
Adolescents face a lot of challenges. As a result, many have received treatment for anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorder, PTSD, or other mental health problems. Consequently, many are taking prescriptions to address the symptoms. Increasingly, doctors are prescribing multiple medications. An analysis of data from more than 2 million New York State Medicaid recipients under 21 years of age showed that almost 6% got such prescriptions, with more than 1/3 of those getting combinations. Some combinations were contraindicated, putting young people at risk for arrhythmias or serotonin syndrome.
Mindfulness meditation has been used to help people manage pain. For years, scientists have assumed that this should be attributed to the placebo effect. Researchers at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine scanned the brains of 115 volunteers while they used mindfulness meditation, sham meditation, and a placebo pain-relieving cream. Mindfulness meditation reduced the intensity and unpleasantness of pain. It did so by changing brain activity patterns in ways that do not resemble the response to either placebo. Areas of the brain important for self-awareness, introspection, and emotional regulation became less connected, which apparently is an important part of the experience of pain. The senior researcher commented, by separating pain from the self and relinquishing evaluative judgment, mindfulness meditation is able to directly modify how we experience pain in a way that uses no drugs, costs nothing, and can be practiced anywhere. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Most people have had a headache at one time or another. The intensity can vary, but even relatively mild pain can make it hard to concentrate. Migraines can put a person out of commission for hours or even days. The pain can be excruciating.
Then there are cluster headaches, which are a different order of magnitude. Patients who suffer this kind of head pain describe stabbing or burning pain centered around one eye. The pain is extreme and extremely hard to treat. Some patients have looked for their own unique solutions.
What they have come up with has many doctors puzzled and a bit concerned.
To help us better understand the patient's perspective, we turn to Dr. Joanna Kempner. She's associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University. She's a sociologist of science, medicine, technology, and inequality, and author of Psychedelic Outlaws, the movement revolutionizing modern medicine, and Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Joanna Kempner.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Kempner, could you tell us a little bit about your personal history with headaches so that people will understand why this topic is not only personal but of great relevance to our listeners?
Yeah, so I began getting severe headaches when I was a little girl, and the first doctor that my mom took me to see told her that I had a type A personality and that nothing could be done. But I come from a family with a lot of headaches, and my mom had chronic migraine. So she knew what it was like to be dismissed and refused to take that as an answer. So one of the first messages that I got growing up was that people should believe me when I tell them that I'm in pain.
That's certainly a valuable lesson.
How long did these headaches last?
I still have them, unfortunately. They got worse over time. I realized when I was getting my PhD in sociology, I was trying to find ways to study gender bias and discrimination in medicine. And I was also trying to find a way to study gaps in healthcare. And it occurred to me that I really actually understood that as somebody who often went to the doctor and was told that nothing was wrong with me or that nothing could be done. I understood that people who are chronically ill are really good guides. If you listen to them, they're really good at telling you what medicine doesn't do and where medicine has a lot of bias. So that's how I got into it. But unfortunately, as I was studying migraine, my migraine got much worse. And that does sometimes happen. Migraine develops into a chronic condition.
We have heard other people describe this interaction with the healthcare system in which they are not believed, and they sometimes use the term gaslighting. Is that appropriate?
Absolutely. I think medical gaslighting as a term is really taken off because it resonates with so many people's experience. I often say that migraine is really painful, but the stigma that is associated with it makes it so much worse. Migraine is one of the most stigmatized diseases, according to research studies that compare stigma across a wide range of diseases. It's sort of almost unbelievable how stigmatized it is. People really absorb that stigma. They become ashamed that they're debilitated by something that so many people think is so common that people should be able to just get over, that it's just a headache. And when people hear that term, medical gaslighting, I think it really, like I said, it resonates with them because they've experienced it so often.
We would like to shift the focus now to a different type of headache, which is less common, but just as awful, maybe even, I don't think there is a scale for awfulness. But you start your book, Psychedelic Outlaws, with a case history. And the case you have selected, you call Sean Slattery. He had cluster headaches that were unbearable. What was his experience?
So I met Sean in a cafe and was asking him a little bit about cluster headache. And maybe first I should explain a little bit about what cluster headache is and why it's different than migraine. So cluster headache is a diagnostic cousin to migraine, but much less common, as you said. Like migraine, which I think many people who listen to this show will be familiar with, cluster headache is a much shorter lasting pain. It only lasts 15 to 180 minutes, but the pain is excruciating. Some people think, actually it's widely considered one of the most excruciating pains a person can experience, more painful than unmedicated labor or a gunshot wound. And that 15 to 180 minutes, I've come to understand it as a medical emergency. It feels like a searing hot iron in your eye. It comes with all of these kind of other autonomic symptoms. And when people experience that pain, they very often consider suicide as a way to escape the pain. And unfortunately, suicide attempts are fairly common in this population. So when I met Sean, I wanted to ask him a little bit about his experience with cluster headache. Sean's a big guy, kind of tall, broad, muscular. And he told me that he had developed chronic cluster headache. So cluster headache usually occurs in cycles of, a couple of weeks to a couple of months, and then you go into remission. When about 15% of people with this disease, they never go into remission. I mean, it's an awful thing if it happens to you. He was completely disabled, and he had isolated into his living in his basement to keep his family from hearing him scream when he was having these attacks. People like to hide when they have cluster headache. It's very frightening to witness somebody having these attacks. So he was living on disability and couldn't find any more. He had kind of exhausted all of his treatment options when he heard that psychedelics were being studied as a potential treatment at Yale University. He called the researcher, left a message. She called him back and she said, "I'm sorry, we're not recruiting for a while, but I have a suggestion for you. There will be a patient conference in Chicago. I think you should go." He lives about 3 hours from Chicago. He decided to risk it. It's very hard for him to get in a car and travel, but he went. That conference was run by a patient organization called ClusterBusters. ClusterBusters developed that psychedelic treatment that was under study. And at those conferences, they do a lot of different things. It's not all about psychedelics, but one of the things they do is they teach the people who come how to grow their own psychedelic mushrooms and how to dose with those mushrooms. Sean left that conference with that knowledge, and he was able to take psychedelic mushrooms once a week. The effect lasted for about a week. He didn't experience, he was taking a relatively low dose. He didn't experience any hallucinations or anything like that. And he was able to leave his house. He was able to rejoin his family. It was a completely remarkable turnaround for him. And that was a kind of story that I heard quite a bit.
Your book is titled Psychedelic Outlaws. And to a certain extent, the ClusterBusters were the first psychedelic outlaws for cluster headaches. Can you tell us how these patients first discovered psychedelics as a treatment for their incredibly painful headaches?
Yeah, so the term outlaws in the book is meant to refer to kind of outlaw medicine generally, which a lot of us practice when we practice medicine outside the bounds of the law. If you borrow codeine for your cough from somebody, you're breaking the law. Outlaw medicine is when when people are so desperate for their care, they have to, they have to find treatments outside of these traditional bounds of medicine. So I just want to mention that first. Everybody I spoke to in ClusterBusters also would have preferred not to be an outlaw. And I think that that's really crucial here. The story of this discovery is fascinating, and it really traces back to the history of the internet, when the first discussion group for the first online support group for cluster headache emerges in 1998, shortly after somebody posts on that discussion group that they are able to use psychedelics to prevent their cluster headache. And actually, everybody ignored that person, more or less, because if you go online and you look for treatments for anything, you'll notice that a lot of people are posting a lot of ridiculous ideas, all kinds of ideas that maybe you wouldn't want to engage with. But that guy, he called himself Flash. He persisted and he kept bringing new evidence to the table. And eventually, it took about a year and a half, people started to listen to him and they started to discuss this. And they started to reach out to headache specialists and neurologists and look for information on their own. And they started to get really interested. And that eventually, a couple months later, didn't start till early 2000, somebody actually decided to try this. They tried to take mushrooms for their cluster headache, and it worked. And that emboldened the next person. And as people started taking mushrooms and it worked, more and more people got interested. And that's kind of the seed of how this movement began.
You're listening to Dr. Joanna Kempner, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University. Her books include Psychedelic Outlaws, The Movement Revolutionizing Modern Medicine, and Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health. She mentioned suicide. We'd like to remind you that 988 is the emergency number for someone in distress.
After the break, why isn't there a better treatment for cluster headaches?
Oxygen therapy can help, but there are problems getting it right.
We'll also find out why conventional healthcare providers seem scared of psychedelics.
We'll also talk with a doctor who treats patients with cluster headaches.
The pain of a cluster headache is considered worse than labor or a gunshot wound.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by AquaTrue, the maker of unique water purifying systems.
Clean water is so important for good health, and we worry a lot about contaminants. Contaminants like PFAS, forever chemicals, or heavy metals, or even plastic particles.
You know, buying water in plastic bottles does not solve the problem. It might even make it worse.
That's why we really like the AquaTrue water purifier. It has 4-stage reverse osmosis, which is state of the art.
You know, it removes contaminants, it's convenient, and it's so easy to set up. I especially love the glass carafe.
So if you care about water quality as we do, please consider the AquaTrue water purifier.
As a People's Pharmacy listener, you get 20% off when you use the promo code PPOD, PPOD, when you check out. Just go to aquatru.com AquaTrue.com.
That's AquaTrue, AquaTru.com. And remember to include the promo code PPOD, PPOD, for your 20% discount on any AquaTrue water purifying system.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Cardio Health is offered in both convenient capsule and powder formats, with each serving containing 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols to support heart health. More information at cocovia.com.
Today, we're talking about headaches from hell and how some patients are using magic mushrooms to overcome the pain. Doctors can't explain the pain of cluster headaches, and prescriptions leave a lot to be desired. That's why patients have taken matters into their own hands.
We're talking with Dr. Joanna Kempner, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University. She's a sociologist of science, medicine, technology, and inequality, and the author of Psychedelic Outlaws, the movement revolutionizing modern medicine, and Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health.
Dr. Kempner, why is it that modern medicine hasn't figured out cluster headaches? Why are they such a mystery? And as you've pointed out, the pain is indescribable for some patients. It's just excruciating. You would think that in the days of, the 21st century, we would begin to unlock the secrets, but it seems like we're still in the dark.
Yeah, it's really troubling to me that medicine, which you think would be really focused on the worst pain that exists, is really not doing a great job treating these patients. It takes on average 5 years for people to get a diagnosis of cluster headache. And in the interim, they are getting all kinds of misdiagnoses. They're getting all sorts of, their teeth pulled, sinus surgeries, lots of, kind of other treatments that are painful and creating all other sorts of problems. It's really heartbreaking to hear what medicine is doing to these patients. And then once you get a diagnosis, the treatments aren't great. So a couple things are happening. Migraine itself is really underfunded. So my background is with migraine. That was what my first book was about. I've been studying the politics of headache disease for a long time. Headache is just super stigmatized, and that means it doesn't get a lot of attention. There are not enough headache specialists. It's a low status aspect of medicine. And cluster headache is a tiny, tiny little part of headache medicine. So I originally thought that was the main issue. And as part of that, because there are so few, cluster headache's a rare disease and it's really hard to get a diagnosis, people in headache medicine who want to study cluster headache have trouble finding research subjects. That's gotten a little bit better with these online support groups. But there's another basic issue that I hadn't anticipated until I really took a look at this, as I was working on this project. Cluster headache itself as a disease is very difficult to study using randomized clinical trials. Just imagine a disease that you only get for a few weeks. Maybe some people get it for a few months, but it can be hard to predict how long your cycle is going to be. And you have to, as a researcher, ask, let's say, Jane Smith to get to your clinical trial when their cluster cycle begins. And you're going to have to not give them their intervention for a week into their cycle. And then you're going to have to get that person to agree to a placebo-controlled trial for the worst pain that exists. That's really difficult. And then, I'm imagining Jane Smith has a job, right? And so they're going to have the flexible enough job where they can just take off and go to the research site. So even multinational companies have a really tough time enrolling enough subjects into a randomized clinical trial to make the kind of knowledge that the FDA really would love to have to develop treatments. So there's just a lot of barriers to creating the kind of data that medical researchers want to see.
Dr. Kempner, one thing that we have heard from people who suffer from cluster headaches is that oxygen therapy can be effective, but there's a problem. Often the insurer won't pay for it.
Yeah, the oxygen problem is been really frustrating. And it's something that ClusterBusters was working on for about a dozen years. I think they may have come close to solving it, but let me tell you a little bit about the struggle here. So, doctors have known since 1952 that high flow oxygen can abort cluster headache attacks. But for the oxygen to work, it has to be delivered at this very high flow rate, about 12 to 15 liters per minute, using a particular kind of mask, a non breather mask. But even when doctors know that oxygen will work, they don't prescribe oxygen, or they do so incorrectly, maybe recommending a nasal cannula, which is ineffective for that purpose. So it's not just insurance that's a problem. There's just getting that correct oxygen set up. Some doctors are hesitant to prescribe high flow oxygen due to safety concerns. But if it's used correctly, it's actually one of the safest treatments that we have for cluster headache. And others simply lack the knowledge of how to prescribe it properly. Then you have this insurance issue. And for that, part of the problem was that I think it's the Office of Medicare Services. I can't remember the exact name of the office.
That sounds right. CMS.
CMS, yes, thank you. Wasn't approving it for Medicare because they wanted a randomized control trial before they would declare oxygen effective. And that was going to be really difficult because who's going to pay for a randomized control trial for oxygen? And, this is common knowledge. All headache specialists agree that this is an effective treatment. And having cluster headache patients use a placebo for this kind of treatment, trying to find investment in the randomized control trial. It's a kind of bureaucratic response that was completely unhelpful. I think ClusterBusters has finally gotten CMS to agree for Medicare to cover oxygen based on other forms of data, but it's been a really, really long slog.
Dr. Kempner, you have this marvelous introduction to your book, a timeline of psychedelics over history. Could you give us a quick overview, please?
Sure. So I start in 8000 BCE, which is when archaeological evidence suggests that humans across the globe are using psychoactive drugs, including hallucinogens. I jump to 1799. Now, we do know that the Aztecs were using psychedelics before then, and you can kind of fill in that gap. But I jumped to 1799, which is when the London Medical and Physical Journal publishes the first medical description of a psychedelic medicine experience, which it characterizes as a poisoning. And I like that contrast because it's interesting to me that in the West, people talked about these experiences as toxic, while indigenous people were using psychedelics as, in sacred contexts. And then I jumped to the late 19th century, which is when Western medicine flirts with psychedelics for the first time. And I also weave in some of our drug laws, which began in the early 20th century. Because I think that that's also a really important part of the story. One of the things that I thought was frustrating but fascinating is the way that our regulatory system splits drugs into health, medicinal or food, which is regulated by the FDA, or sort of controlled substances that are toxic or poison and are regulated by the Department of Justice. And so I wanted to really weave in some of those events as well. And then we get to the mid-20th century, which is, of course, when Albert Hofmann is synthesizing LSD. And then there is a huge moment in the 1960s, and when we start seeing policies that really drive how our regulatory system today handles drugs and as medicines and as illicit drugs. That's how we get in 1970 to the Controlled Substances Act. And then in the 1980s is when we see the emergence of some of these psychedelic philanthropies, which are really pushing forward the psychedelic science that we see today. And then I add on towards the end the landmark dates that mark this story I'm telling in this book with ClusterBusters, beginning in 1998, when Craig Flash Adams posts his first online message about psychedelic treatment of cluster headache.
Well, that is a super summary of the history. Tell us a bit about how you envision the future of these compounds.
I can tell you my hope for
Yes, absolutely.
That. So there are various imaginaries that people hope for when they talk about these substances. One is the medical route through the FDA, where you have to go to your doctor to get a prescription, and maybe you have to have a therapist with you. And I think that is a great way for lots of people to gain access to psychedelics. But I don't think that's the only way we should be engaging with these treatments. Medicalization is not medicine, is not an equitable institution in the United States. And these are going to be really expensive therapies, particularly if you need a psychotherapist with you, which for something like PTSD, you definitely would. So I would also like to see decriminalization alongside this. I don't think anybody should be going to prison for ingesting a psychedelic. Nobody should be punished for trying to be well. In between, there are various kinds of models that people are bouncing around with legalization. Those are a little bit thornier to get into, but certainly we need to stop sending people to jail.
Dr. Kempner, we've been talking with you primarily about headaches and psychedelics, but psilocybin has been used for a number of other conditions, including PTSD, including the existential crisis associated with cancer for some people, including hard-to-treat depression. I wonder if you could describe some of the other uses for psychedelics and psilocybin in particular.
In medicine, most of the applications for psychedelics are psychiatric. So depression, PTSD, as you had mentioned, and that is rooted in its initial uses in the 1950s. The end-of-life anxiety that we're seeing psychedelics being used for is really fascinating. The root of that begins in 1964 with an anesthesiologist called Dr. Cast, who was actually using LSD as an analgesic, or he was running a trial to see on end-of-life patients, and found that people who took LSD didn't need nearly as much opioids as the ones who were on placebo. It was actually a pain study. What came out of that was a fascination with end-of-life anxiety. He had noted in one of those studies that a lot of the patients he gave psychedelics to no longer worried so much about death. And it's that kind of small finding for him. It was his sort of side, this observation he made that's been developed. And I think that that's really fascinating, that the pain alleviating aspect of LSD sort of fell out, that we didn't pursue that as much as we might have. There is now an NIH request for proposals to study LSD assisted therapy for pain. So maybe in the future, we'll see a return to that kind of research.
Dr. Kempner, you write that magic mushrooms are not a magic bullet for these very painful headaches. Why not?
One of the things that Bob Wold, the founder and executive director of ClusterBusters, likes to say is that you can't bring a transformative medicine into a broken system. And it's not that he doesn't believe in magic mushrooms, because he does. I mean, he spent his life trying to get doctors to study this treatment. But there's this bigger problem with medicine as an institution. If you can't get a diagnosis, if you can't get people to believe you're in pain, if you can't get insurance companies to pay for a treatment, then it's not really much use. And Bob Wold has spent a considerable amount of his time trying to get people access to oxygen therapy, which he knows works. So that's what I mean, that magic mushrooms aren't a magic bullet, right? The best treatment in the world can't help anyone if we don't have a system that can deliver it.
Dr. Kempner, you're a sociologist. You've studied how medical practice reflects biases in our society. What can you tell us about political suppression of science, and in particular, why psychedelics are so scary to conventional medicine?
So the narrative that we have about psychedelic science is that the counterculture led to prohibition of research, and that scientists have now remembered that psychedelics were this great medicine and we should bring them back into universities. That's not really what happened. That is only true if you think about research as something that only occurs in universities and in, pharmaceutical companies. When prohibition comes into play in the 1970s, the experimentation flourishes, but it flourishes in the underground. And when the internet comes to be, drug experimentation really takes off. ClusterBusters really helped me understand that story, because experimentation for patients is also happening with the internet. The internet really helps people find each other when they're sick, really helps people figure out new and novel treatments. And it was those two worlds that really found each other in this particular case. The underground, and in this case, like these kind of internet worlds, serves as a place where counter knowledge can occur. It's a place where experimentation and knowledge can be made away from the regulatory system. What we're seeing now with the revival of psychedelic science is that underground knowledge coming back into universities and being validated by scientific methods. The research that we're seeing at Yale on cluster headache and psilocybin comes straight from ClusterBusters. And I think that that's such a great model for understanding how we can resist suppression of science more generally. Looking towards spaces where regulatories can't see necessarily that science is happening, right? Looking towards the counter public to maintain knowledge that we think should be happening, but for whatever reason can't be happening. And we have other examples of this too. We can think of the women's health movement in the 1970s, producing knowledge outside of medical settings. These are all really great ways to think about how knowledge can be produced when it would be otherwise suppressed.
Dr. Joanna Kempner, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Joanna Kempner, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University. She's a sociologist of science, medicine, technology, and inequality. Her books include Psychedelic Outlaws, the Movement Revolutionizing Modern Medicine, and Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health.
We turn now to Dr. Emanuel Schindler, who's a board-certified neurologist and headache medicine specialist. She's medical director of the Headache Center of Excellence at Veterans Affairs Connecticut Healthcare System and assistant professor of neurology at Yale School of Medicine. Among her efforts to optimize the management of headache disorders, she's executed the first controlled trials of psilocybin in headache disorders.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Emanuel Schindler.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Schindler, we just had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Joanna Kempner about her book, Psychedelic Outlaws, the Movement Revolutionizing Modern Medicine. And we understand your specialty as a neurologist is treating headache disorders with particular interest in cluster headaches. Why is it that diagnosis is so challenging when it comes to cluster headaches?
Yes, that's a great question. There are a lot of patients with cluster headache. They go years being misdiagnosed as having another headache disorder or even having a psychiatric disorder. And for how characteristic the headache attacks are in cluster, you'd think you'd never miss it, but they still do get missed. One of the reasons is probably because cluster headache is not very common, so people don't even know about it. They think all headaches are the same, whether it's migraine or tension type or cluster, maybe something they've never heard of. They think it's all the same. And then the pain intensity of cluster headache is so intense that some practitioners don't believe that the patients are actually having that much pain. It must be something psychiatric. And I've unfortunately met one or two people who were even locked up in the psych ward because they were told that this was all in their heads. And meanwhile, they're suffering with cluster headache without treatment.
Dr. Schindler, when we spoke with Dr. Kempner, she said this is among the most excruciating pains that humans ever experience. Is that really true?
Well, there was yes. That's the short answer. The long answer is that several years ago there was a survey that was carried out by University of West Georgia. Larry Shore was the principal investigator on that, and he was the first one who really tried to quantify how painful is cluster headache. So he asked patients who took part in this survey to rank on a scale from 0 to 10 how painful is your average cluster attack, and then he also asked how painful is, if you've had it, sciatica or kidney stone or gunshot wound. And so a lot of these patients have had multiple other pain conditions. And on average, the intensity of a cluster attack was somewhere around 9.5. And the next most painful conditions, I think it was childbirth and gunshot wound maybe, they were somewhere around 7. So for people who have had multiple different types of painful experiences and cluster headache, they always rank cluster headache higher.
Now, Dr. Schindler, you said that cluster headaches, in addition to being extreme pain and very intense, have a characteristic pattern. Perhaps you could describe that for us.
Yes, this is one of the things that makes cluster headaches so interesting is the attacks themselves tend to happen the same time every day. Not in all patients, but in the majority of patients, they can almost set their clock to when their attacks are going to happen. Unfortunately, most of them happen around 2 or 3 a.m. And this has been found in different surveys in different countries even. So no matter where you are in the globe, if you have cluster headache, you will tend to get it between 2 and 3 a.m. It's probably linked to the sleep cycle, but some patients have attacks during the day as well, but they always tend to be the certain time of day. And then the majority of patients who have cluster headache, they're episodic. So they only have the headaches for a certain period every year. And those periods are also cyclical. So that it may be that patients have it every spring and every fall for a couple months. Or I've even met patients that have their cycles every 15 months. So every year it's the following season. I've met people who have cycles every 4 years, and they never come early, they never come late. It's every 4 years. So this is really fascinating that this condition runs on a clock like that, and it allows us to better understand the human brain too.
Why do we call them cluster headaches?
Because the attacks tend to cluster around a certain time of day or a certain time of year.
We have been told that oxygen can be incredibly beneficial. But for years, we have heard from patients who say it's hard to get oxygen. That is to say, my doctor won't prescribe it, or if my doctor does prescribe it, it's very hard to get payment help with it, and it's pricey. What's the latest on oxygen?
So yes, for a long time, there are challenges in people being aware of oxygen, insurance companies covering it. And one of the arguments that the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid had for a long time was that though there aren't any large randomized control studies showing that proving that oxygen works. And this was kind of silly because it's been used already for decades. And no one's going to do a large study where you have to randomize people not to get oxygen to suffer through attacks. No one's going to do that study. So through patient advocacy, a lot of work over many years, the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid revised that a determination about oxygen to make it easier to get. And after CMS follows that, then the other insurance companies sort of follow suit.
You're listening to Dr. Emanuelle Schindler. She's a board-certified neurologist and headache medicine specialist. She's medical director of the Headache Center of Excellence at the Veterans Affairs Connecticut Healthcare System and assistant professor of neurology at the Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Schindler led the first controlled trials of psilocybin in headache disorders.
After the break, we will learn about other promising therapies for cluster headaches.
What do patients report about the effectiveness of psychedelics for cluster headaches?
Could psychedelics produce long-lasting remission in some cases?
Neurologists may be reluctant to prescribe something that has been illegal.
We'll also hear about side effects and safety concerns with psilocybin for headaches.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This podcast is brought to you in part by The People's Pharmacy and our exclusive line of magnesium-rich roll-on deodorants crafted with years of expertise and community feedback. Our customers rave about their ability to control odor effectively without aluminum.
These deodorants are a superior choice for daily health and comfort. It's designed to be gentle yet highly effective, providing reliable odor control without aluminum or other harsh chemicals. Plus, they're incredibly easy to use and long-lasting.
As a special offer for our podcast listeners, enjoy an exclusive 20% discount on any size of our deodorant. Choose between the handy 2-ounce scented or unscented varieties or the economical 3.38-ounce unscented version.
Simply visit the body care section in the store at peoplespharmacy.com and enter the promo code POD20. That's POD20. That's POD20 during checkout to redeem your discount. Remember, this promo code POD20 gives you 20% off your purchase of our top-rated magnesium-rich, aluminum-free roll-on deodorants until October 2024.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Cocoa Via Dietary Supplements. cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health, made with proven concentrated flavanol extract. More information is available at cocovia.com.
Today, we're talking about the excruciating pain of cluster headaches. We've learned about patients who have used psilocybin to get relief that conventional medicine could not provide.
We turn back to Dr. Emanuelle Schindler. She's a board-certified neurologist and headache medicine specialist. She's medical director of the Headache Center of Excellence at Veterans Affairs Connecticut Healthcare System.
Dr. Schindler, what other sorts of therapies are showing promise for treating cluster headaches?
Well, over the past few years, there have been some new treatments that have come out for cluster headache. For example, one of the CGRP monoclonal antibodies, galcanezumab, has been approved. There's also the non-invasive vagus nerve stimulator that's also been cleared, FDA cleared for cluster headache. But all of these new treatments take many years to be developed and to be approved, and they have limitations, access limitations, high cost as well. So cluster headache patients have a history of finding things on their own that work for them. And for almost 30 years now, cluster headache patients have been talking about clinical effects with psychedelics. And the information that they've learned through trial and error using psychedelics serve now as a model for the clinical trials being done in cluster headache with psilocybin and also LSD.
And how effective are these treatments based on the patient experience?
So there's sort of two questions. Not only how effective is it, but what is it doing exactly? We talked about oxygen earlier. That's an abortive treatment just to stop one attack. It doesn't stop a cycle or prevent a future cycle. A preventive treatment for cluster headache is very valuable too. So while psychedelics can stop a single attack, that's not very practical. Number one, it takes too long for the psychedelics to take action. And because patients have multiple attacks per day, it's also not a very practical way to manage cluster headache. It's the preventive or the sort of long-term effect that these drugs have that seem to be effective and also unique. And what patients have reported is that taking a single dose or even just a couple of doses over a couple of weeks can lead to long-term reduction or even elimination of the attacks. And there's really nothing else in headache medicine that you can take once or twice and then have a significant reduction in the headache burden like that.
Let me see if I understand what you just said. Taking a psychedelic like psilocybin can, in some instances, produce long-lasting remission. Is that correct?
That's what patients have been reporting, yes.
Any idea why or how that's happening?
That'll probably take the rest of my career to find out. And but it's also important to keep in mind that psychedelics are chemically and pharmacologically similar to other existing headache medications. So it's good to learn from the medications that we also know about, see how they're similar to psychedelics, and see what psychedelics offer that is different. For example, psilocybin and LSD are very similar to a medication called DHE, dihydroergotamine. DHE is also used as a short-term treatment to help bring people into temporary remission, but you have to take it intravenously or inject it under the skin for a week or sometimes more for longer protocols for the effect to happen. So there's something different. Although these chemicals are chemically similar to DHE, they work with just one or two doses in some cases.
Now, it's my recollection, and I might be wrong, that ergotamine, and I don't remember if it would have been dihydroergotamine or ergotamine itself, was used a long time ago as a treatment for migraine.
Yeah, the entire ergot class, so there are a lot of different drugs in that class, ergotamine, dihydroergotamine, have been used for migraine. And when you make different congeners, when you manipulate them a little bit, then they have different properties. Some you can't use, some are safer. One really important ergotamine, methysergide, which was the brand name Sansert, was actually made off of the LSD molecule. LSD was created by Albert Hofmann back in the 1930s. He was looking for a vasoconstrictor and a bronchoconstrictor that could have use in medicine, including migraine. And so when he came back to LSD in 1943 and discovered its properties, it still had potential as a medicine, but it's not very practical to take a medicine where you have altered sensation like that. So one of the congeners of LSD was methysergide, and it's non-psychedelic. It's taken every day as a headache preventive. It was used both in migraine and in cluster headache. And it was a very effective preventive, but it had to be taken every day. It didn't have that same potency where you could just take it a couple of times and have a long-lasting reduction. But over time, it was found that in taking methysergide chronically, it led to tissue fibrosis, and it was taken off the market. This was very similar to the diet pill fen-phen, similar. The activity at the serotonin 2B receptor causes this tissue fibrosis. So it's important when looking at psychedelics or congeners of psychedelics to be aware of where they're binding and what the frequency of use is, because even a small change can make a big difference in the binding profile, and a small change in how you use it is also really relevant.
If scientists are developing research protocols to follow up on what patients have been sharing amongst themselves, can you tell us anything about the protocols for these studies? Have any of these studies been concluded yet?
Yes, there have been a couple. So using the main protocol that is used by cluster headache patients, it's the cluster busting protocol. So it's a low dose of psilocybin, and it's 3 doses, 5 days apart each, and that's the busting regimen. And it can help stop a cycle, or it can help patients who have the chronic form of the disease, where they have headaches year round, bring them into temporary remission. So there was the study that I did here at Yale, and also there was a study that was also concluded that was taking place in Denmark. We both used the same protocol, the low dose psilocybin, which approximates 10 milligrams of the synthetic drug, 3 doses, about 5 days apart each. And the frequency of the cluster attacks are measured before and after the treatment. And in both studies, keep in mind, this was a study here in the US and a study over in Denmark. Both studies found about a 30% reduction on average in the cluster attack frequency over several weeks.
Dr. Schindler, psychedelics still have a kind of a shady reputation in the United States. And I'm guessing that most of your neurologist colleagues are a little skeptical or even resistant to prescribe a drug like psilocybin. And clearly, the FDA has not yet approved it for anything. PTSD, hard to treat depression, or cluster headaches. What do you hope for the future?
Well, yes, you are correct that my neurology colleagues, they know me as the one who studies psychedelics, who studies mushrooms. So, but they are coming around. I've given neurology grand rounds here at Yale talking about my research. I've been invited to other neurology groups to talk about the research. So the interest, it is picking up. And I think where it's also important to note that the way that psychedelics are used for headache medicine, it's somewhat different than for other conditions. Every condition, it's used a little bit differently. in general, for mental health studies, it's used conjunctively with some type of psychotherapy that is treating whatever it may be, whether it's depression or PTSD. For cluster headache and in the work I've done in migraine, the drug is given as a drug by itself. There's no therapy going on because we're not separately treating the condition with therapy. So this is a very different protocol than the ones that are used in mental health. It's a different approach, and it's something that neurologists are more comfortable with. That the idea of giving a drug to treat a condition and then looking after the drug to see if there's a change. So this is sort of more palatable to neurologists, I think, and that's perhaps why they have an interest in this on the headache side.
Dr. Schindler, one of the things that patients always want to know is what are the potential side effects? Can you tell us about the safety of these compounds?
Sure, yeah. So for these studies, we do careful screening, looking for both medical and psychiatric conditions that would make it less safe or not safe at all to take psychedelics. As I mentioned before, psychedelics are chemically and pharmacologically very similar to some other existing headache medications. For instance, triptans, like sumatriptan, for example. Patients who have had a heart attack or a stroke should not take these medications, and we have that similar restriction for the studies with psilocybin. And patients who, in general, have unstable medical conditions, uncontrolled hypertension, or who have end-stage renal conditions, or who are on dialysis, those patients we also uh, don't study in the studies because we don't know of all the bad effects that might happen. We also don't enroll patients who have a history of any psychotic or manic conditions because the psychedelics they could trigger an episode in those patients. And then it's also relevant to consider whether you're studying a single dose versus if you're studying a protocol where the doses are being repeated. Like I mentioned before, the history with methysergide, there are big differences between taking something frequently or chronically versus something just being administered once or twice.
Dr. Schindler, there are lots of other headaches. You mentioned migraines. Does psilocybin or other psychedelics help with migraines?
Yes, so there are reports going back in the scientific literature going back over 50 years, and then there may be earlier reports as well. But yes, there are reports of LSD and other ergots having effects in migraine. Again, both as an acute treatment and also as a preventive. I looked at migraine and psilocybin in a small pilot study, and again, this was the same dose used for the cluster headache study, so approximately 10 milligrams of the synthetic drug. And after a single dose, the frequency of migraine, it was reduced by half. In that first study, I only looked out over 2 weeks. I recently finished up a follow-up study where I looked out longer. So, when I can publish that study, I'll be able to expand on that some.
One of the things that's so puzzling to me, the idea that you could get benefit from something like psilocybin that might last not just months, but even years, kind of defies our conventional knowledge. Do you have any idea what's going on in the brain?
We have ideas because there are more labs now that are doing imaging studies looking at the connectivity of the brain and different changes in the brain, both during a psychedelic experience, but then also afterwards. And I'm also preparing some more research to do the same thing, to look at how the brain connectivity may change after psilocybin, not during, but afterwards. So in terms of this long-lasting effect, I think that for headache disorders, it's less often that I hear about cluster headache patients who will do the busting regimen and then go years without attacks. Patients will often have to repeat. So the effect may not be the same for all conditions. And also keep in mind that in mental health studies that the psychedelic is paired with psychotherapy. So the psychotherapy is also offering treatment, and there's often or there is a continued treatment with that. So I think that it's important to keep in mind what's being studied in terms of how long the effect will be, and also are there other therapies going on at the same time that are maintaining that effect.
Dr. Schindler, we've been talking primarily about cluster headaches and a little bit about migraines, but there are so many other headaches that require a good diagnosis and then targeted treatment. I'm thinking about things like an ice pick headache, and you'll have to tell us what that's like and how it differs from a sinus headache or a tension headache or menstrual migraines.
Well, I don't think you treat an ice pick headache.
Well, let's find out. What are all of the kinds of headaches that you have to deal with, and how do the treatments differ?
Well, if you have some free time, there's a 200-page document. It's the ICHD, the International Classification of Headache Disorders, and there, the first 7 pages of that document is the table of contents, and every line on those 7 pages is a different headache disorder or subcategory of that disorder. So you're right, there are a lot of headache
A
disorders
lot.
out there, and some of these headache disorders, they're primary, meaning they're not being caused by something else. For instance, you mentioned sinus headache. So sinus headache, if we didn't have sinuses, we wouldn't have sinus headache. And migraine can be secondary. For instance, in post-traumatic headache, where someone has a head injury, overwhelmingly the type of headache that will emerge is a migraine-like headache. Cluster headache can also be secondary. Everyone who has a new diagnosis of a cluster headache, who hasn't already had it for many, many years, should have brain imaging to make sure it's not a blood vessel malformation or some other type of growth. So one of the jobs of a headache specialist is to make sure, is this a primary headache disorder? So is it not being caused by something that structural or something else in the body, or is it secondary? Is it being caused by something else? Because headache is not only headache disorders themselves are disorders, but headache itself can be a symptom of many other conditions, medical conditions that can manifest with head pain. But a headache disorder is a condition where you get these episodes of head or face pain without it being caused by something else. So it's something with the software in the brain that is leading to these headache attacks. We all have the hardware to have a headache, but people who have a headache disorder, there's something wrong with their software.
There are so many new headache treatments on the market that it kind of boggles the mind. And there are so many commercials on television. I am sure that a lot of people suffering from headaches and or migraines are also confused. And I wonder, how does a headache specialist such as yourself choose between Aimovig versus Nurtec versus Emgality and Ajovy, and then there's Botox and Ubrelvy and Qulipta and Zavzpret and Vyepti, and I'm just running out of names because there's so many. How do you choose the right drug for the right patient, and how do you get approval from insurance companies?
Well, I'll start with the last question, and I may not be the right person to ask that because I actually practice at a VA hospital where I don't have to worry about insurance, but we do still have sort of stepwise programs where we have to try a certain number of drugs first before we can get to the newer ones. But you might ask the same question to a physician who's managing blood pressure or diabetes, or a mental health professional who is managing depression. the commercials are more for the patients, I think, just to get them aware of things. But the practitioners, there's part of the art in medicine is learning over time what treatments tend to work better for what patients, and there's also some research behind that as well, which treatments tend to work better for different types of headache disorders. We also try to use the side effects of a medication to benefit someone. So, for instance, the CGRP antibodies you mentioned, the Aimovig, there are also three others. They could cause constipation. So, someone who has IBS of the diarrhea form would benefit from that. So, um, benefiting off of the side effects of the medications is also how we pick and choose.
Dr. Schindler, we have two friends. They're men. Each of them suffers from a headache every day. They've both been to numerous neurologists and headache specialists, and neither of them have received any treatment that actually works. We saw one of our friends recently, and I said, well, after all these years, and it's now probably 10 years, I said, John, is anything helping? And he said, nah, not really. I mean, it's a little less severe now than it was 10 years ago, but I still have headaches every single day, and no one's been able to help me. Have you run into patients like that? And what do you do when someone has a chronic headache, that is to say, every single day, and nothing has worked?
Yes, I do have patients like that, and it's good to step back and get a really good history in terms of even if the headaches began X number of years ago, did you have headaches in childhood? Is even going all the way back and seeing if there's any headache history. Also, what happened around the time when the headaches began? Did it happen after a head injury, after an infection? Anything happen around that time? I'd wanna know features of the headaches. Is it a continuous 24-hour headache, or is it that you have a headache every day, but then it goes away, and then it comes back the next day? And how long does the headache last when it does come? 'Cause that can distinguish different headache types. I'll also ask whether there's a difference if you're lying down or standing up, so you could have a spinal fluid leak, and you tend to be better when you're lying down and then worse when you're standing up. I ask about medical history because there can be medical conditions that also lead to headaches. One of the ones that is highly comorbid in headache disorders is sleep apnea, and those patients will often wake up with headache and may get better during the day, but it may not totally go away. Neck and back injuries, shoulder injuries can also lead to headaches that can be pretty persisting. There are eye conditions too, sinus conditions, ear conditions that can also have headache as a another feature of those conditions. So, getting a really good medical history and seeing if there's something that is causing the headaches, and I wouldn't expect typical, say migraine meds to work for those headaches if for those headaches if they're being caused by something else.
Dr. Schindler, we've heard of something called rebound headaches. And I think anybody who is a regular coffee drinker knows this can be a problem because when you have been drinking coffee for months or years, every day, 2, 3, 4 cups a day, and then all of a sudden you have to go in the hospital and they say, oh no, no coffee for you. And then boom, you get hit with a very nasty headache. But we've also heard there are medications that can cause rebound headaches. So when people are buying over-the-counter headache remedies, sometimes they even have caffeine in them. If for some reason they stop taking them, they may get a rebound medication-induced headache. Can you explain what these rebound headaches are about and what people can do about them?
Sure. So and there's actually debate in the headache medicine world about this phenomenon. It may also be called medication overuse headache or medication overexposure headache. there's sort of two things to consider. One is the taking something every day, like taking Tylenol every day for headache, or even using caffeine to treat headache every day. Your body may actually become dependent on that treatment, so that when it's not there anymore, whatever symptom it was covering up is now back. But then there's also a different, what I think of rebound more is someone takes a medication, and then a few hours later the headache comes right back immediately. And this is even in someone who doesn't take the medications every day. So it doesn't happen to all patients, but some patients say that if they, for instance, take a triptan, for example, the headache may come back a couple hours later, even after it seems to have worked. And that's different from someone who's taking a triptan almost every day and their body is dependent on it, so that when they run out, then the headaches come back. So those are sort of two different phenomena that uh, the one involving taking something every day, that one, it's both easy and hard to fix. The easy thing is that you really shouldn't be managing a headache condition where you have headaches every day with an abortive medication. So that's where preventives come in. So taking an abortive treatment as your only way of managing a headache condition is going to end up with you having this medication overuse phenomenon. In terms of the other one I talked about, where you take a medication, even if you don't take it that often, and a few hours later the headache comes back, that's probably not the right medication for you. There's probably something that your body is that it's causing a new kind of headache to come back, or maybe the same one that didn't quite go away all the way. So in that case, revisiting and seeing, is this the right abortive for you? Yes or no? Probably no, and then trying something else.
Dr. Schindler, what are your hopes for the future with regard to, for example, drug development, the Food and Drug Administration, and ultimately your colleagues, headache specialists? What do you hope for psychedelic research?
Well, I think some of it is already starting. Neurologists and headache specialists are becoming more interested in psychedelic research. So that's definitely something that I hope for, more headache specialists wanting to take part in the research. And then I also would hope that regulatory bodies, whether it's the FDA or others, would also recognize that the treatment of headache disorders is different from other conditions, and every disease that is being studied should be looked at in a different way. And the people designing those studies and carrying them out should be those who actually care for those patients.
Dr. Emmanuel Schindler, thank you so much for talking with us on The People's Pharmacy.
Sure, thank you. I had a great time.
You've been listening to Dr. Emmanuel Schindler. She is a board-certified neurologist and headache medicine specialist. She's medical director of the Headache Center of Excellence at the Veterans Affairs Connecticut Healthcare System and assistant professor of neurology at Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Schindler led the first controlled trials of psilocybin in headache disorders.
We spoke earlier with Dr. Joanna Kempner, author of Psychedelic Outlaws, the movement revolutionizing modern medicine.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Memory and Focus is a unique formula made with a special blend of ingredients that work together to promote attention and support long-term memory. It supports 5 areas of brain performance in one capsule. More information at cocovia.com.
Today's show is number 1399. You could find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's also where you can share your comments about today's interview. You can also reach us through email radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider, including YouTube. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning. This week's podcast will have additional information on the timeline of how psychedelics have been used for healing and how else they're used. We also discuss other types of headaches and how to select the right treatment.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter and get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast. You'll know ahead of time which topics we're covering.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.